All righty. Okay, so if you have volunteered with us before, worked on Tennessee specimens, it's very likely you've come across something that looks like this. So specimens from the Sharp-Hattori Bryogeographical expedition to East Africa in 1968. We have a lot of them. And it was sponsored by the University of Tennessee, as well as the Hattori Botanical Laboratory in Japan. And a lot of these specimens were collected in Tanzania, or the United Republic of Tanzania, as it's known today, which is a country here on the east coast of Africa, you can see in green. And that expedition was led by our prolific A.J. Sharp, so bryologist, professor, and herbarium director here at the University of Tennessee for a very long time. But he's not who I'm going to be talking about today. So if you look at these labels from this expedition, you'll see Evelyn Sharp, who was AJ's wife. But in addition to that, there's a whole host of other names. And it stood out to me because these are not names I've seen on other Sharp expeditions, and I don't feel like I've seen them outside of this particular trip. So I thought it was interesting, kind of wondered who are these people who were collecting mosses with them in Tanzania over the small little window. And so I would kind of try to look into their names and see if I could find some information. So hit some dead ends on some of the names so far, not a lot of information, but one of the people that I was able to find out quite a bit about is a name you might have seen is D.E.F Vesey-Fitzgerald, which I feel like is kind of an intriguing name anyways. You'll also see him on there as D. Vesey-Fitzgerald. And this specimen here you can see is one of them, collected in June of 1968. That whole expedition basically lasts from June to August of that year in Tanzania, in Meru East. So that name references Mount Meru. So that's a dormant volcano in Tanzania. So that's in Arusha National Park, which is here in kind of northern Tanzania. This is actually the city of Arusha here in front. That's a name you'll see on a lot of the specimens. And I found this really beautiful satellite image of Mount Meru and one of the nearby craters that, again, are locations you'll see listed on a lot of our specimens. So the specimen itself, in this case, is here on the left. You can see with a lot of soil accompanying it. And this moss is Funaria hygrometrica, which is a moss that is found on shady, moist soil. It can also be found on moist walls, the crevices of rocks, and places where recent fires have taken place. So that's kind of interesting. That's why one of its nicknames is the bonfire moss. And I found these really pretty pictures of it growing in a burn site. And I think this is somewhere in the Northwest United States, but this variety, calvescens, apparently is quite common in the tropics. So that makes sense with Tanzania. So the collector's full name is Leslie Desmond Edward Foster Vesey-Fitzgerald. So quite a name from someone who has a long name. That's a very long name. And you will see it listed on specimens as LDEF or DEF or just D. Vesey-Fitzgerald. Interestingly, it looks like legally his actual full last name was Foster Vesey-Fitzgerald. It's hyphenated from his parents, but he never used the whole thing. He just went by, normally went by Desmond or a lot of times by Vesey. And it said that many of his African colleagues actually called him Bwana Mongosi, which means Mr. Skins, referring to the boots that he was always wearing, which I thought was interesting. So he is an Irish-born entomologist, ornithologist, naturalist, ecologist, conservationist, and plant collector. So not specifically really a moss or lichen expert. Very well-rounded. And he was born in 1909 in Dunleer, Ireland. Now, weirdly, a couple sources have it down as 1910. One of them says he was born in London, so like not 100% sure about this, but seems to be the consensus is Ireland. And I had to do some digging, so it took me some time, but I was able to find some pictures of him, which is great. So this is one of him in the field. You can see him inspecting a tree in the Kibondo district, which is actually in Tanzania. So before he ended up in Africa, he went to school and graduated with the Bachelor of Science from Y Agricultural College. And that is associated with the University of London, but it's actually in Kent, which is in the south of England. In 1932, he joined the Colonial Service and was an associate of the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad, so in the Caribbean. And the next 3 years, he spent studying biological control of sugarcane pests in Brazil, in British Guiana, which today is Guyana, and the British West Indies, which today are a variety of independent island nations in the Caribbean. After that, he made a big move, and from 1936 to start working on pests of coconut palms in the Seychelles, which is a group of islands in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. He worked also in Madagascar and on the Eastern African coast. He also got married during that time period. And then the couple moved to Malaya, which is, at the time was a group of states on the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia, plus Singapore, the island of Singapore, that was under British control at that time. And he worked as an entomologist for the Rubber Research Institute. And rubber was a really interesting, a really important industry there at the time. So it said that it was grown on more than 3.25 million acres in Malaya, and nearly 500,000 tons were exported annually. So really huge, important crop. But then in 1941, he joined the World War II effort as part of the Federal Malay States Volunteers. But the region was actually taken over by Japan in 1942. So he moved to Africa, or to the Middle East. We're getting there. So from 1940 to 1942 to 47, he actually worked in the Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Oman, also as an entomologist, working with the Middle East Anti-Locust Unit, which is really interesting. So apparently locusts were a huge problem. They were decimating crops in that region, and that was endangering the food supplies to troops who were fighting in North Africa, Allied troops. So it was really important for them to get a handle on this. One article I read said that the Allies considered their anti-locust campaign in the Middle East to be second only in importance to their campaign against the enemy. MEALU organized a series of annual military operations to find and exterminate the locust breeding grounds in Arabia. These operations were hugely successful and made an important contribution toward winning the war in the Middle East. And that unit was made up of not just British Army personnel, but British and Arab civilians. Vesey actually received, was invested as a member of the Order of the British Empire for his work during this time in 1946. So after that, he moved to Kenya in 1947 and became a senior assistant game warden for the game department. In 1948, he was appointed the wildlife biologist for the game department, and I found a kind of a funny story about that. So apparently he was tasked with setting up a booth for the game department at the annual Royal Nairobi show in Kenya. And he basically spliced together 2 rhino horns to make a giant rhino horn to set at their booth to kind of catch people's eye and bring them over to the booth. But I guess years later, this horn was found in a storage closet, and people thought it was real. And they're like, this has got to be like one of the records. This has got to be one of the biggest horns ever. And actually for a time was listed in Roland World's Records of Big Game, so this book, until Vesey found out about it. And he thought it was hilarious, but he did let them know that this actually was fake. And he like quietly took it out of the list. So I thought that was pretty hilarious. One of his first assignments in Kenya was to do a vegetation survey of the Tsavo National Park, which might sound familiar to a lot of you in reference to the infamous Tsavo lions that kind of terrorized that region about 50 years earlier, so in the 1890s. And that's down here in kind of southeast Kenya. But that did not happen because he was called away to join the Red Locust Control Unit in northern Rhodesia, which is now today the country of Zambia. And he was supposed to just be there for 3 months, but he ended up staying for 15 years. So quite a long time. He worked as a senior scientific officer, and kind of similar to his work in the Middle East. They were looking to find and control locusts, in this case, the red locust, at their breeding grounds and try to prevent massive, massive hordes of them swarming the rest of the country or the rest of the continent. So found some really cool resources online. There was this really neat diagram showing kind of the breeding grounds here striped in East Africa and how they could migrate and swarm all throughout Northern Africa, the Middle East, and even into Asia from there. There's a lot of really cool photos as well. So these are all just some pictures from Ethiopia in 1958. You can see just how numerous the locusts could get, how much they could be super destructive to crops. I found this one here from 1955. This is actually in Tanzania. And if you look, the photographer was D.E.F Vesey-Fitzgerald. So he was actually documenting this year. It sounds like it's interesting. So apparently they would scout out in trucks to see where they were living and breeding, and they would be spraying to knock down the populations. But that was only during the dry season. So in the wet season, they really could not travel with traditional vehicles. So they had this really strange machine called the swamp skipper, and it could drive on wet ground, it could drive on flooded ground, it could actually float. So they used that to get around and try to find where these locusts were out in these areas, which is pretty cool. And also too, with planes and helicopters, they would scout out to look for these bugs. So another cool thing when I started looking into this locust unit was I was able to find a few more pictures of Desmond Vesey-Fitzgerald. So this one here, it says there's a couple people talking to an unknown visitor, and then next Desmond Vesey-Fitzgerald, also the locust survey, and Steve Simon, district commissioner. So I'm assuming you mean that this is him. It's kind of hard to tell. I think, he has glasses. Both of these guys have glasses and mustaches. So this guy has a similar hairline, but he's got a hat on. So he's one of these two people anyways, presumably this one, but I'm not 100% sure. It's kind of hard to tell. This one here is the Red Locust Control Staff in 1956. And again, he says, they say he should be the 7th person in the middle. So that's him here. Again, it's kind of dark, but glasses and a mustache. So I guess that could be him. There's a couple of other ones. This is a plant collector from Kew Gardens. I'm discussing a specimen with Desmond Vesey-Fitzgerald and some agricultural officers. Again, I think this is him here, glasses, and then they always talk about him wearing these leather boots. So that must be him there. And then the last one is just this one here, alfresco lunch with him and some officers. And I think that's him there. With the glasses. So kind of cool to see some more images of him and out in the field doing some work when he was, I guess, in Zambia. So after that, so after his 15 years in Zambia, he moved to work for the National Park Service of Tanzania as an ecologist. He lived in a little house on the Meru Lake or the Momella Lakes in Arusha National Park. And worked with a team of local Tanzanians to document the wildlife and plants within 3 of the northern parks, and helped set up a framework for the management of those parks. And that's where he was working in 1968 when A.J. Sharp came to do his moss survey. So I think it makes a lot of sense that he would have been enlisted to help to do this survey. They did a lot of collecting in Arusha National Park and those national parks that were on his list. And obviously he had been there for 4 years, and he had been in East Africa for 20 years. So a really great resource to have for that project. So it's said that the last 10 years, his 10 years in Tanzania were some of the most productive of his very productive career. But he passed away in 1974 in Nairobi, Kenya. So one source says he had expert knowledge of insect pests, obviously, and a broad knowledge of other invertebrates, especially butterflies and dragonflies, as well as mammals, birds, and snakes. He authored numerous works on a wide range of topics, from the vegetation of the Seychelles to the snakes of Zambia and Tanzania. He was an authority on grasslands, the grasslands of Central and East Africa, and he produced several works in the last decades of his life on those. You can see here, so this is not an exhaustive list, but you can obviously see there's a huge range of places and forms of life that he studied and wrote about, which I think is pretty impressive. And his final work, A Guide to the Snakes of the Tanzania and Kenya Borderlands, was actually published in 1975 posthumously. It has some really great diagrams and pictures and some just really adorable little snakes. If you're into that kind of thing, I would check it out. So in addition to his recognition as a member of the Order of the British Empire, he was also a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society, the Bryogeographical Society. He is commemorated in the plant species Aloe vesii, as well as a grass genus, so Vesey-Ocloa or Vesey-Ocloa, and Vesey-Fitzgerald's burrowing skink, which is a lizard endemic to the Seychelles, which is pretty cool. So he worked, let's see, so we worked on at least 3 continents, and his interests include most forms of life. So obviously that's reflected in his specimens. We have at least 800 in the BRAPET portal from this expedition that he was involved with, the sharps. But there's also, well, and then the 3 lichens, so not a whole lot. But there's also over 1,200 specimens linked to him in Bionomia and GBIF that I was able to find. You can see, plants, fungi, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, insects, so kind of huge range of specimens, and I'm sure that's not all, so there's got to be a lot more out there. So, and like I said, I did find evidence that he described it a new species. He wasn't really a taxonomist, but a number of specimens he collected ended up being new species that were described by other people. So you can see these are just a couple examples of types and holotypes that he collected that ended up becoming new species. So that is quite a trip around the world with D.E.F Vesey-Fitzgerald. Not really a bryologist, but definitely a very prolific scientist and natural history collector. So I'll just end with a little quote from his obituary. So it said, he was a most unusual person, and his death, like the crash of a fine old cedar in his beloved forest on Mount Meru, leaves a gap in the canopy to mark where once he stood. For his colleagues in Tanzania, Momella will never quite be the same again. So pretty sweet. And kind of poignant if you think like he died fairly young, so he was only 65, and probably could have done a lot more, but did plenty in his time frame. So yeah, so thanks for listening, and I'll keep trying to see if I can find some information about some of those other collectors from that expedition, and I'll let you know. So anyways, I'll stop there.